Hello and welcome to CounterCulture. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, it is April the 23rd. It is St. George's Day. So a very happy St. George's Day to you. I do hope that you're celebrating. As you know, that we talked about St. George's Day in England a week ago. We're carrying on that theme today. I'm very, very pleased that we have as our guest the Emeritus Professor of French History at the University of Cambridge, Robert Toombs. Professor Toombs wrote a book, English and Their History, back in 2014, which was then called the standard text, or rather that it should be the standard text for the coming century. And that is praise indeed. It's hugely critically praised. So I'm very pleased that he's with us today, as indeed back in person is Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, historian and commentator, and of course for the New Culture Forum. So, gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us. I wanted to start really by asking you, Robert, your book at the time, when it came out in the reviews, was seen as being breaking with the tradition that had been in place since about 1960 of relative self-criticism of England. Do you think is that a fair analysis of your book?
Well, I was asked by, I think it was by the Dublin Review of Books, if I'd written a patriotic history. And I said I wasn't sure I had, but I didn't think I'd written an unpatriotic history. Yeah. In the sense that I didn't think it was part of my job as a historian, or historians' job in general, to deprecate the subject that they're writing about. And I don't have pessimistic views about England or Britain, nor do I think that our history is an unrelievedly dark and shameful one, which, of course, some people do seem at least to imply. So I suppose, now, I don't know that I've broken with a lot of tradition, in the sense that many academic historians, in fact, write pretty dispassionate history based on research. But that's often the sort of history that the general public doesn't read. It's not really intended for them. It's intended for professionals. And so I think the picture that we often get of our past comes not from academic historians, but from television programs, films, novels, and so on. And there, I think there has been a tendency to be, let's say, extremely suspicious of anything that sounds as though it's self-satisfied or praising the country. Why that should be is another question.
Can I just? I want to quote her. There's a wonderful quote that from the book, and I've just quoted here. England is a rambling old property with ancient foundations, a large Victorian extension, a 60s garage, and some annoying leaks and drafts, balancing its period charm. I think that's beautifully put.
Thank you.
How did you come up with that? Where does it leave us now? We've got a 60s garage and some annoying leaks and drafts, but do you think there's going to be a kind of modern extension somewhere along the line?
Well, you have to constantly renovate old houses. We all know, those of us who live in even fairly old ones know that you never actually stop. And the idea that somehow you reach a point of stasis in which nothing ever has to be done again, of course, is wrong. And we know that we have all sorts of problems which are partly of our own creation, but to a large extent are because the world is changing around us. And therefore, we do have to adapt. We know, for example, that there are considerable inequalities within the country. We know that many aspects of our educational system are less good than we would want, though it seems to me that they've been improving. So you've constantly got to, if you accept my analogy with a house, you've got to be repainting the window frames, and you've got to be changing the wallpaper. But it seems to me that the overall structure, despite what some people say about the fragility of the union, seems to me to be pretty solid. And I sort of chose the house analogy because I was thinking of a street full of houses, and in that sense, the world is made up of nations, all of which are houses. They're all somewhat different houses. In some senses, they're rather similar. They all have doors and windows and roofs, but in lots of ways, they are different. And I think, in a sense, one can only decide whether one's own house is working or not by occasionally looking over the neighbour's fence and seeing how they're doing. And that, I think, is what I was trying to do, partly because it's, I'm a French historian, as you said. And I think, if we want to say what is wrong or right about our own country, it does us good occasionally to look at others and say, how well Finland is doing in teaching its children mathematics. But on the other hand, France is not very good at handling its race relations. And trying to compare what we do with what others do and seeing if we can learn lessons, and occasionally perhaps even that we can give examples.
Rafe, here we are in the house called England, but it's one of the features of so much discussion at the moment is, well, people go backwards and forwards between England and Britain, don't they? There is this constant confusion in people's minds, or not confusion, but just simply they don't quite know what the reference should be. How do you think that's come about? I mean, it's still the case now, isn't it?
It's very much the case, but if I can just take Professor Tombs' domestic analogy a step further,
yes.
That house that has been so lovingly lived in by generations of Englishmen and women is on the verge of being inherited by the next generation, who would be keen to tack on a condemn sign to the front door, unfortunately, by which I mean, if you look at current polling, fewer than 50%, 45% of young English people have any pride in Britain, compared with 72% of older generations, which is in stark contrast to, for example, the Scots, where there's an 80% approval of Scotland across the board, across the age range. And what's interesting is in Wales, there's a complete reversion of those stats, whereby the older you are, the less pride you'll have in Wales compared to the young, whereas in England it's actually the reverse. And part of the reason for that is, of course, this ability to equate England with Britishness, where we are in a situation whereby our three Celtic neighbours are free to sort of gorge themselves on lavish portions of national bluster. There's nothing wrong with being a proud Scot or a Welshman. But unfortunately, all of the sins of Britain seem to be uniquely laid at the foot of England. And the Scots, who were absolutely complicit in the empire, and nobody were more gung-ho about the Scots, who, after all, tried with their Darien scheme. One of the reasons for entering the Union was in order to actually benefit from imperialism, have somehow managed to create this impression, this myth, that they are also one of the oppressed, with Braveheart and so forth, not one step apart from those people in Africa and elsewhere. There's remarkable mythology that has been created. And so, because of the times that we live in at the moment, with this cultural revisionism that's happened, whereby everything that we're taught in schools and so forth seems to put a negative slant on British history, that's been laid at the doorstep of the English house. And I think that's really where my concern is that England has become forgotten in all of this.
It's sort of become forgotten, but is it not the case that it's also not forgotten? I mean, in the case that some sort of memory has come to the fore in recent years. So, for example, to use it's a bit of a hoary old chestnut now, but in 1966, if you look at the World Cup and England were playing, it was full of Union flags. Whereas now, when you look at football matches, it's full of England flags. I mean, it seems that there is something that is actually, if you like, being remembered now, or at least refreshing. Would you not say, Robert?
I think that people, I think there is a generational difference. It's true. Young people often want to be rebels against their parents' generation and their parents' values. That's probably universally true. And if you can associate rebellion with a form of nationalism, then it attracts young people. If that nation or that nationalism is associated with the status quo, which English nationalism in a sense is or has been, then the young tend to reject it. Of course, they may grow into it as they get older. Yeah. People's opinions change with age, and I think I think opinion polls show that we're not really very different from that in most other countries. But I think there are two things. One is that I think English identity has often been deliberately played down in order to buttress British identity. And one distinguished Indian historian, in fact, Krishan Kumar, said that it was always a good idea if you were the dominant partner not to bang the drum too much. So the English, I think, quite deliberately took a sort of back seat, and still many do. It was thought to be not terribly English to do too much flag waving.
Yes.
Certainly not to boast about how important you were. And I think that's one aspect to it. I think you're right that we've had a lot of, let's say, negative propaganda. That's true. But I think that this is something that goes beyond England and has really started to affect all the English-speaking countries. And I think the obvious sort of macro explanation for that, I think you see it even more in Australia, and you obviously see it much more in the United States, is that I suppose the English-speaking countries are associated with the world as it is. In many ways, we've helped to create the world order as it exists today, or as it's existed for the last few generations. And therefore, a rejection, a rebelliousness against what's seen as, an oppressive, racist, capitalist system is associated with the English-speaking countries. And very fashionable causes today, which clearly do appeal very much to young people, are often seen as being in opposition to an English and American and Australian tradition of national existence. I think in some ways much more so in the case of newer countries like Australia or Canada than in the case of an older country like England.
It's very true that the dominant force within a union or a federation or a confederation will always be the most likely to identify with the umbrella term. So the English, the Prussians, the Serbs will identify as being British or German or Yugoslav, as opposed to, say, the Welsh or the Bavarians or the Croats. And the English were therefore happy to actually see their achievements, their national values, their beliefs, and their qualities woven into that British national fabric. But there comes a point when they see injustices now taking place. We're no longer Britain is Britain is now, well, I know Professor Robert Toombs doesn't quite believe in the decline of Britain to the same degree that is often bandied about by popular historians. But certainly, following the collapse of empire, there seemed to be, within this resurgent these Celtic neighbours of ours, this throwing the baby out of the pram and seeing those countries rewarded by it. And so the English therefore saw devolution. They saw an assembly and a parliament being created. They saw the tax money that they were sending off to Scotland, and it seemed as if there was some sense of fair play not being played out, which is another English quality, if you will. And it was from there that I think you see the resurgence of English nationalism. It came upon around that time. If you look at it was from devolution onwards that you tended to see this rise in St George's Cross, and this St George's Day cards even began to be sent out. And there was a point, when you had this bizarre situation where you had Ken Livingstone as mayor, and at the time I wrote Red Ken Turn Green, whereby he gave funds for a St Patrick's Day parade, but he wouldn't allow a St George's Day parade because it was divisive. And Roger Scruton also comments about a chap who, during the election time, graffitied "Remember England" on a wall and was charged with racial aggression. Now that seems to cut against the English concept of fair play, when there's nothing wrong with a Scot, covering himself in blue woad almost, and yelling freedom.
Yes. Despite, sorry, you want to come in there, Robert?
Well, I was just agreeing, really, but I think what's just been said makes it very clear that we're talking in some ways about the attitude of the elites, if one can call them that, who tend to dominate public debate and certainly control much of the media and the airwaves. And hence, if the elite, which is, I think, the case in Scotland, is largely sympathetic to Scottish nationalism, then you will get a promotion of Scottish nationalism as somehow virtuous. What we see, as you were saying earlier, in the display of flags of St George at football matches, this is absolutely not an elite phenomenon. It is, in fact, a kind of rebellion against an elite orthodoxy. Now, there's a kind of paradox here. The Scottish nationalists like to think of themselves as rebels, but they are, in many ways, the elite. England is often seen as representing the elite, but in fact, an English sense of identity is very often subversive of those what the elite would like us to think and what the elite would like us to behave. I'm sounding terribly populist now, but I'm not terribly ashamed of it. I think one can use elite as a shorthand term, and we all know what it means.
Yes. One thing actually that in your book, which is actually quite remarkable considering what we've been through over the past year, is that you go through certain things for which the English tend to be castigated. And one of them is the subject of slavery. And, obviously over the past year, we have seen this extraordinary, I would say, attack on history, which is being centered around colonization and slavery. But you make the point that the English role in stopping slavery was actually possibly just far greater than the efforts of William Wilberforce.
I mean, slavery was, as we all know, a horrific system. It just so happens that it was practiced universally, and it has been throughout human history, from prehistoric times to the 19th century. And and Britain, the United Kingdom, England, and of course also Scotland and Ireland, played an important part in the slave trade during the 18th century. But so you could say, well, there's nothing, that was a terrible thing, but there was nothing actually unusual about this, and that everybody else was doing it too. And that many quite decent people thought that slavery was just in the nature of things. It was in the Bible, it was in the Quran, the ancient Greeks had done it, the Romans had done it, therefore it was just a fact of life. What is extraordinary, as you suggested, at least what is distinctive about Britain's involvement in slavery is that it deliberately and voluntarily renounced its own role in the slave trade and banned it, and then went to considerable efforts to stop slavery and the slave trade by other countries, even at the risk occasionally of serious international conflict, friction with the Americans, serious friction with the French, and with the Spanish and the Portuguese and so on. But nevertheless, a major effort to stop the slave trade, first of all, and then later on to stop, both by persuasion and by force, slavery itself. Well, this is a remarkable story, which I think partly thanks to the agitation around slavery has now got into the public consciousness, perhaps not the intention of those who were carrying out the demonstrations, but nevertheless, I think many people now realize how remarkable this intervention was. I mean, the embarrassing thing, I suppose, for many progressives is that the empire itself was an instrument in the abolition of slavery, where its writ ran. And so you could logically say that you hate slavery or that you hate imperialism. But at times it's quite difficult to say that you hate both simultaneously, as one was the instrument for abolishing the other.
Yes.
And I think we maybe haven't quite got to grasp that in our debates on this subject. As, for example, if you want to decide what children should be taught at school, that's going to be a very controversial subject.
Yes. But I think the slavery is the classic example of what we were just discussing earlier, in terms of how here you have an example where Britain, I'm trying to focus things on England because it's St. George's Day, but let's say Britain, single-handedly led not single-handedly, but was the preeminent force in abolishing the slave trade, an example to all, and yet it's uniquely, it seems today, the Anglo-Americans who are being blamed for all of the evils of slavery, despite the fact that there were as many slaves in Africa being held by other Africans, and that the slave trade continued in the Arab world well into the 20th century. And it's just another example of how we are losing this connection that we have to the glorious achievements of England, which have now become part of British culture, but none of which are being celebrated. Famously, Orwell famously wrote in his essay "Lion and the Unicorn" about how intellectuals despised England and would be more likely to be seen stealing from a church poor box than standing for God Save the King, and that's always been the case. But the problem now is that those intellectuals are more present in more institutions than has ever been the case before. They're in our schools, they're in the National Trust, they're in our cultural institutions, they're in the civil service, they're in the BBC, they're everywhere. And so as a result of that, we are losing that connection. You know, my favourite quote about England of all time is always Winston Churchill's, when he said, "There is a forgotten, nay, almost forbidden word which means more to me than any other. That word is England." And when you look at the achievements of England, and I don't want to sound like some sort of bombastic sort of patriot here, but I would say in creating the modern world, with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, all right, it didn't create capitalism, but no country, I would argue, did more to actually develop capitalism and spread it around the world than England did. In medicine, the very police force, the military structures, the civil service around the world, parliamentary systems around the world, the legal system, even dress, everywhere in the world people wear the suit. The Japanese call it a Savile Row, right after Savile Row. These are uniquely English inventions which have gone global, but because we've always been a dominant force, we've never actually had put much stock in actually celebrating that fact. In the same way that you don't find a little England like you do a little Italy or a Chinatown around the world. The English just assimilate and give their things up. And we're now, I think, paying the price for that, because it seems to me as if England is the greatest example within Europe of a country that is losing its sense of identity. And you see that again, to go back to polls, England is the only country within the UK that believes that its finest days are behind it. If you ask the Scots and the Welsh and the Ulstermen, their best days, they believe, are ahead. The English are unique within these islands of thinking that the past was a better time than today.
Although, isn't it interesting that actually Churchill said that about, a forbidden word? I don't know when he said it, Rafe, when actually he would have said, but even that far back he was saying that. I mean, this is something that seems to be, you say that the English think their best times are behind. Maybe they always thought that. I mean, isn't that part almost of the English temperament? I mean, if there is such a thing. Before we ponder that, I was very fascinated by something in your book, actually, Robert, which was that the British or the English, whatever, actually, when we're talking about slavery now, insisted on writing a ban on slavery into the 1815 Treaty of Vienna, which ended the Napoleonic Wars. I think you say that this was the very first sort of human rights clause ever put in a treaty. I mean, that's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yes, I believe that's true. It was at least a commitment. Okay, like many human rights clauses in treaties, it was not a watertight one, but it was a commitment to phase out the slave trade, which Britain was able to do because of the huge role it had played in the wars against Napoleon, and especially its subsidy of its allies. And the reason was, I think, and someone's just written a book about this, which I'm waiting to get a copy of, but it was largely due to public demand, in which women and children, as well as men like Wilberforce, of course, as we know famously, were putting pressure on the government to do something to stop the slave trade and to stop slavery. It was often connected with evangelical Christianity, the sense that people who were God's creatures and who had immortal souls like us were being treated as animals, and that was a wicked and unforgivable crime. William Pitt who was Prime Minister, pretty well said that. And I think the government was responding to a deep demand on the part of public opinion. And so if this was the first civil rights clause in an international treaty, I think you could probably say that this was the first civil rights movement in history, in which ordinary people were demanding that their government take action in a matter that they considered of enormous moral significance, even if it was one that they were making money out of, or at least some people were making a lot of money out of it. And that, of course, was why it took quite a time for it to be abolished. Slavery and economies that use slave labor, things like sugar production, coffee production, cotton production, were hugely valuable and profitable. And for many people, slavery was the only way that they could be exploited. So you had to be willing to take a major economic hit if you were willing to abolish slavery and the slave trade. And to their great credit, our our predecessors, many of them, were willing to do precisely that.
Yes. Why do you think, Rafe, I ask you actually, why do you think that England, English being English, has more of a kind of primordial pull than, say, British? I think that Robert actually quotes in the book, Rupert Brooke's famous line, there will be if I should die, there's a corner of a foreign field that is forever England, not Britain, forever England.
That's right.
What would you say?
Well, I would say quite simply because Britain is a political construct.
Right.
It was a solution for a problem of the time. Now, my view has always been that you can be both British and English, and one of the shifts that we have seen, it was always the case, with the exception of Ulsterman. Ulsterman would always identify as being British first and Ulsterman second. But after that, it was always the English who would identify as being British first and English second. But we're seeing a shift there. We are seeing a considerable growth in the number of people who identify as English first, and even some who don't regard themselves as being British. And you would even comments on YouTube videos and so forth, you've seen this, which I'd never seen before, growing steadily. But it's also because, people, wherever you are in the world, this is not a uniquely English phenomenon. You identify with place, with home, with a pastoral scene, and it's the countryside, it's those bucolic scenes that forever identify yourself with your homeland. Keep the home fire burnings, there's no place like home, and it's the land that is the direct connection. I always try to put it like this, certainly with reference to myself, but it's almost like Kipling and Chesterton, in the time of the Boer War, the term Little Englander was created. But it was actually
with the term
so. Little Englander at the time was actually an insult towards people on the left who didn't want England to engage in imperial entanglements and expand itself, whereas people on the right were much more jingoistic. So Kipling was, of course, said, "What know ye of England? Who I can't remember who do not England know." But anyway, the point is, it's been changed now. But Little Englanders of the time very much believed in that left-wing view to a degree of domesticity. England was with the hearth. It was on the cabbage patch. It was growing your earth. It was, living in a small little cottage, as opposed to British imperialism. But I think, that there's a space for both of those qualities as you can have. When I go abroad, I'm British. When I'm at home, England is my home, and it's to England that I identify rather than Britain. And that's unfortunately something that we're beginning to lose.
Robert, do you? Sorry, may I ask? Do you sort of describe yourself as English or British?
Well, I think I agree. It depends on the circumstances. I think.
Yeah.
Though when you go to some countries, of course, I go to France quite a lot. The French have always called Britain England. They don't. Indeed, I remember one French newspaper reporting on a rugby match and saying there were lots of English and Scots and Irish and Welsh and other sorts of English people. So they've always regarded the other. They often regard Scotland as simply, part of England, rather like as Burgundy is a part of France. And it's actually very difficult to think of us as a multinational state. But I think, I tend to think of myself as British abroad, as you said, and probably English in this, this more sentimental and even poetical sense. Britain is not a poetic term in the way that England or Scotland or Wales or Ireland are.
I think, just like with France, America also tends to talk about England. It very rarely talks about Britain. It talks about the Queen of England, not the Queen of Great Britain.
And I think that's the point that we're actually at now.
Yes.
Scots are always identified as being Scottish.
Yes.
In fact, just the other day, I was looking on Wikipedia, and you have George Stephenson, inventor of the railways, who was a British engineer, and then you had MacAdam, who invented, the tarmac, who's a Scottish engineer. So it's as if every English contribution becomes a British achievement. Flanders and Swan put it very well Flanders and Swan in the 50s wrote a song of patriotic prejudice, which is very good about England. But Flanders opened it by saying, "Have you ever noticed it's always another triumph for Britain, but England loses again."
What would you say? Actually, something's emerging there of the humour of England. But you talk about poetry there, Robert. How would you sum up a kind of essence of Englishness, if there is such a thing, whether it be in landscape or culture or wherever, what is it to you? What immediately comes to mind?
Well, I think, although I'm a town boy, I mean, I was brought up in the Black Country. I hardly saw a blade of grass before I went. But I suppose I tend to think of it, as many people do, in a rural way, which is, you think of Elgar and you think of Constable and you think of Turner. You don't really, at least I think many of us feel it in that way, which is, of course, in some ways a paradox, because we are one of the most urbanized, and we're certainly the first urbanized nation due to the Industrial Revolution and so on. And so we that may be one of the reasons why you were saying there's a strong sense of history or of the past in ideas of England. It's in some ways always perhaps been associated with a sense of nostalgia for, merry England, for a rural society that we've lost. There was a famous book by a Cambridge historian called "The World We Have Lost," and it was about this kind of thing, this culture that has now gone. I think we're not probably unique in that. I think all countries tend to be nostalgic about the golden age of their childhood, or perhaps of their parents. But perhaps England has had it for longer because we were the first country to, in many ways, to cut our roots with tradition.
Would you go along with that?
So we live in cities. We love buying cottages, and people retire to the country and they buy thatched cottages and so on, and they keep them beautifully. That's a pretty English sense of belonging, I think.
But also you see this, do you not, in the great expansion of metro land in the 1930s. All the houses are half timbered. They're all around a kind of fake village green. I think it's charming, actually. But Rafe, what would you think is the essence of Englishness for you?
Well, I would agree, on a personal level, I would agree with that. I think it's always dangerous to try to ascribe qualities of national character or the essence of a nation, given that if you have two Englishmen together, they'll probably say two different things. The England of Morrissey and Billy Bragg isn't the England of Margaret Thatcher and Noel Coward, or Jacob Rees-Mogg, Dennis Skinner, both very English, probably have radically different attitudes. Again, dissenters and radicals and high Tories. There's a whole different idea about what England truly is. But when I lived in Canada as a teenager, I used to take This England magazine every month. And there was always a pastoral scene on the cover, of the Downs or of a Cotswold village with its, or cookie box cottages and so forth. For me, I was born in Ealing, short stroll from Ealing Studios, and so it's the Ealing comedies that really that's ultimate essence of decency, simple, good old-fashioned decency and fair play and humour. That is the essence of the English character for me personally.
But just to finish off, and it's quite a very big topic, but when we're talking about the past, Elizabeth I was the last monarch of England, purely of England. Do you think that Elizabeth II could be the last monarch of the United Kingdom? Do you think there is a chance of that, Robert?
Well, of course, people are now talking about the breakup of the Union. It seems to me almost. It seems to me very unlikely. Let's put it that way. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that there's going to be a breakup, and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland will become independent, or that Northern Ireland will join the Republic, because the disadvantages of that for them are so enormous that you would have to be crazy to do it. And so I think the Queen and the Queen's successor will still be monarchs of the United Kingdom. Mm. What worries me more is that we shall become much more unhappy, or at least some people become much more unhappy with the Union, and we become rather like was said of the Habsburg Empire. Everyone has to be kept in an equal state of mild dissatisfaction, and that we should be constantly trying to cope with the disaffection of parts of the Union rather than seeing it break up. In some ways, breaking it, you could almost say that breaking it up would at least be a fresh start. I would hope we never do that, but I hope that we shall find some way of reconciling people to the union. And I hope, I'm optimistic enough to hope, that Brexit is actually going to make this more likely in future.
Do you have that optimism?
Yes, I'm fairly certain that the union will continue. Of course, if Scotland left, Wales is still part of the union, so you could technically still have the United Kingdom, even though Wales isn't technically a kingdom. But the UK, certainly, I don't see there being any great chance of it splitting asunder. But of course, it doesn't need to come from Scotland. There is enough angst in England growing about the place of England within the union and its lack of an assembly and the other disparities that it sees, that it could actually be England that forces the question.
Exactly. I don't know whether you gentlemen agree. I still think that St. George's Day should be a public holiday. It's quite extraordinary that it's not. So we shall make that appeal on ending the programme. Look, thank you very, very much, Robert, for joining us. Thanks, Rafe, very much. And a very happy St. George's Day to you, whatever you're doing. We are certainly celebrating it here. So see you next time. Thank you.